Hi, I'm Len Rydell, Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society, and I'd like to welcome you to another lecture in our Petersburg Appomattox Symposium and Tour, which was conducted in September of 1996 out of Petersburg, Virginia. Our next speaker is a man who's familiar to most all of you. He is now the director of the Civil War Institute, Peter Carmichael. Peter succeeded Gabor Borit at Gettysburg a number of years ago, has gone through significant health challenges, recovering, I believe, from a brain tumor, and he still runs the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg, which is a big confab of Gettysburg fans that gets together every year at Gettysburg College to ponder all things Civil War and primarily a lot of all things Gettysburg. But at the time that I selected Pete for this, he was a seasonal who was getting his doctorate. He was under the tutelage of Gary Gallagher, a very well-known Civil War historian. And Pete had worked as a seasonal down in this area. And one of his books that he had written, one of his early books that he had written, was about Willie Pegram, a Confederate cannoneer. The Pegrams, of course, were a very fascinating family, and I won't steal any of Pete's thunder by going into it. But Willie is killed here in the siege of Petersburg near the end, over towards Five Forks, and is much lamented that as this loss has taken place. And so, when you look and consider Willie, I just thought that because of this, because of Five Forks, and because of Pegram's 15 minutes of fame, that this would be an excellent, just informational, biographical type of presentation. And so Pete was quite happy to work with us, and I was delighted to invite him to give his first Blue and Gray Education Society presentation. Like I say, it's always fascinating to see where these people go on to bigger and better things. But I knew Pete when he was young and when he didn't have a PhD and when he didn't have a big job at Gettysburg. So please sit back, relax, and enjoy a young Pete Carmichael talk about Willie Pegram. Our last talk this morning, I want to just open it by telling just a real brief story. Not even really a story, it's more or less just an impression I've had in working with people in the Civil War over the last 10 years or so. I'm really very encouraged by the level of scholarship that is coming out now in the Civil War. There is admittedly a lot of bad writing, and there's good scholarship coming out. And what makes me encouraged for the future is when I look at the quality of new young historians that are being generated and mentored through the system. Our next speaker this morning is an individual in that mold. He is a protege of Gary Gallagher, who many of you are familiar with. He is completing his doctoral work with Gary at Penn State University. He also has a master's degree at Penn State. He is outstanding in the extent that he, in addition to being already a published author at a very young age, with this outstanding book on Willie Pegram published by the University of Virginia Press, which does not publish a lot of Civil War books. He has also won the Graduate Teaching Award for Penn State University as the Outstanding Graduate Teaching Assistant, which was awarded to him in 1991. He has come down, he has worked in the summer here as an adjunct park historian at the Richmond National Battlefield Park, and now I believe you're doing some adjunct teaching work as well, which is the reason that Pete will have to leave us shortly thereafter. After his talk this morning, he's got some teaching responsibilities. However, Pete has written a book that, if you have not yet read it, I really do highly encourage you to do so. The story of Willie Pegram is in so many instances and is so indicative of the story of the Confederacy and the story, in many instances, a lost cause. It's talking about a young man, who really represents so much of what this idealism was all about. It is eye-opening, it is profound, it is provocative. I think that once you consider the essence of this man, you've already heard Dick Summers talk about in his talk today, I think you will truly understand a lot of the essence of what is the cause of the South and how it affected so many individuals in the South. Please join me in welcoming Peter Carmichael.
I had an eventful trip down from Richmond in the rain. Actually, the rain wasn't very bad. I had the misfortune of my windshield wiper coming off. So I had the scraping sound all the way down like someone had their nails against a chalkboard. I had to listen to that all the way down to Petersburg. So my nerves were frayed, not from the rain, but from a faulty windshield wiper. Dr. Summers talked a lot about the conclusion of Grant's Fifth Offensive. Pegram, as Dr. Summers mentioned very briefly, played a key role in that. He would write a letter shortly after the conclusion of that campaign. He was exhausted, as he wrote in the letter, tired. He'd been in the saddle continuously. And, in fact, he even mentioned, thank you. He mentioned in this letter that in this past week that he had been under more fire than he had ever been during the entire war. They were saying quite a bit about Willie Pegram, artillerist under Robert E. Lee, one of Lee's hardest fighting artillerists, a man who had an insatiable desire for combat. In fact, during the fighting, Grant's Fifth Offensive at the Battle of Squirrel Level Road, Pegram even received a minor wound. He informed his family, though, that he was recovering very well from that. And also, at the conclusion of this campaign, he took the opportunity to reflect on military operations. He was extremely confident that whatever Grant might organize against Lee's forces south of Petersburg, that the Confederates were prepared to defend the city. And then he also mentioned about the Army itself, kind of reflected upon the Army's experience, about what had happened in the last week. And this is what he said to his mother and to his sisters in this letter. He said, "It would be impossible for the best writer in the world to do justice to this noble army. When I reflect upon this campaign, it seems to be the most remarkable in the annals of history. For 5 long, hot months, this army has been fighting largely superior numbers." And although Pegram boasted about the accomplishments of the Army of Northern Virginia, in this letter you get a sense that he's uneasy, that there's some tension, that he had this idea that the people back home, that the Southern civilians, that they thought something was lacking in the Army of Northern Virginia now. And so Pegram felt compelled to, in essence, defend the reputation of the Army of Northern Virginia. And so he continued in this letter. He said, "The reason why the men do not charge the enemy out of their works, as they did in 1862, is not from the want of courage, but from the want of physical strength." He said he mentioned these facts in justice to this noble army, to show you the reason why it does not achieve the brilliant feats that characterized it in 1862. A month's rest in the country and a little reorganization, he added, would allow the Army to show itself to be the equal to more than it ever has done before. So you get a sense that Pegram's on the defensive here because, again, he's afraid, he's fearful that his family, that civilians, that they question the character, the behavior of the Army of Northern Virginia. Because Pegram saw firsthand that his men, that the men in other commands, that they fought as bravely as they ever had done before. But Pegram also knew that the men had changed their behavior in combat, that they had modified what they did in battle since the beginning of the war, and they did that because of rifled weapons and entrenchments. Pegram himself was an example of that. Pegram modified how he used artillery, and his actions during the siege of Petersburg demonstrate how he became more conservative and how he employed his guns. He matured, became more prudent, and I would say even became more effective. And again, I can't overemphasize the fact that he did this because the nature of the war itself had changed. And Pegram, like so many other Civil War soldiers, had to adapt to that. You can see this dramatic shift in how Pegram handled his guns by looking what he did earlier in the war, when he was just a young captain commanding the Purcell Artillery. Purcell Artillery was raised in Richmond, Virginia. Representative of how Pegram handled his pieces earlier in the war, we should turn to the Battle of Beaver Dam Creek, or Mechanicsville, during the 7 Days Campaign, the very first major battle of that campaign. Pegram had 6 artillery pieces. He accompanied Charles Field's Virginia Brigade. It was the very first brigade to attack a very strong, formidable Union position at Beaver Dam Creek. Federals were riding earthworks. They had clear fields of fire. So here you have 6 guns accompanying this Virginia Brigade. They charged straight ahead against this Union position. Pegram unlimbered his guns, exposed to a mass cannonade. Because of the organization system of the artillery in Lee's army, it did not allow for the artillerists to group their guns together. Instead, the batteries were dispersed, so they couldn't coordinate or concentrate their fire. So there's Pegram all alone, facing this massive demonstration of Union ordnance, and his battery was decimated. He lost so many cannoneers that by the end of the day, he had dismounted from his horse and helped load the pieces. One of the most outstanding descriptions of Pegram's battle at Mechanicsville comes from Francis Dawson. Francis Dawson, who would later serve on James Longstreet's staff, has a book called, is it Reminiscence of the Civil War, Dr. Summers? Is that the right title? Yeah, I think that's the right title. Reminiscence of the Civil War, published by LSU, and it's a very, very good book, and it gives very interesting detail about the fighting at Mechanicsville. At the end of that day at Mechanicsville, Pegram had lost 42 men out of 92 that had started the action. 42 men, either killed or wounded, out of 92. Staggering losses. No other battle in Lee's army came close to sustaining those kinds of casualties. He'd also lost 3 out of his 6 guns, and he had over 15 battery horses disabled. He did this because Pegram insisted on bringing his guns as close as possible to the enemy's lines. That's what he did at Mechanicsville. He would do that in a number of other battles earlier in the war. He wanted to rush his guns, get them close to the enemy, unlimber, and fire rapidly as possible. He was asked once that it wasn't as destructive, counterproductive in the process. This man asked him, "You're wrecking your battery." Pegram admitted that in fact, that it was very deadly to handle your guns in this very aggressive manner. But he said that ultimately, by doing so, he thought he would be able to inflict more damage against the enemy. I really doubt that that's what happened at Mechanicsville. I'm sure that he did very little to hurt or punish his Union adversaries. But nonetheless, earlier in the war, Pegram was of the mind, rush your guns, get them close to the enemy as possible, unlimber, and fire. He combined this aggressive use of artillery by a personal leadership that was very bold, very reckless at times. He believed that it was his responsibility to do everything in his power to defeat the enemy, and in the process to inspire his men to those same feats of courage. He was absolutely contemptuous of the enemy's bullets, fearless. He did this time and time again, from the beginning of the war all the way through the siege of Petersburg. I think what again is representative of his style of leadership earlier in the war was the Battle of Cedar Mountain in August of 1862. Again, Pegram was just commanding the Purcell Artillery. The Federals advanced toward the Purcell Artillery. Early's Virginia Infantry Brigade was supporting the battery. They broke and ran, leaving the battery isolated and alone. The Federals were getting closer and closer to the guns. Pegram's cannoneers increasingly getting more and more nervous, looking at each other, waiting for Pegram to order his guns off the field. Pegram, of course, did not want to abandon his position. That was not according to his code of honor or duty. And so to inspire his men to stay at their post, he grabbed the battery flag and yelled, "Don't let the enemy have these guns or this flag. Go on, men, give it to them." Well, Pegram finally had to relent, finally had to limber up his pieces, retreat off the field. Later on that evening, after the battle, Pegram overheard some of his men remark that they almost lost their guns to the enemy. Pegram overheard this. He said to them, if the enemy ever takes one of my guns, look for my dead body in front of me. Shortly after Cedar Mountain, Battle of Fredericksburg, December of 1862, this time Pegram's cannoneers abandoned their post. Can't really explain why this happened, but they did. They left their post. Pegram, desperate to get the men back to the guns, took the battery flag off its staff, wrapped it around his body, and walked among his guns until his men would return to their post. What Pegram did at Cedar Mountain, what Pegram did at the Battle of Fredericksburg, he did consistently throughout the war. And I think that Pegram's contemporaries, the people that knew him before the Civil War, they were shocked that battle transformed this man into such an ardent fighter. And I think if you look at a picture of Willie Pegram, you can see why they were so shocked. He looks more like a scholar instead of an artillerist. He has little gold spectacles.
How old?
He was, when he commanded the battery at Mechanicsville, he was 21. He was born in June of 1841. Just a kid. Always wore these gold spectacles. Looks a lot like Dustin Hoffman, as you can see. He was very shy and reserved, largely because he was so embarrassed by being so nearsighted. In fact, he was so nearsighted that one of his contemporaries, a South Carolina artillerist, said that Willie Pegram couldn't even recognize his own horse very often. Now, I don't know what that says about him as an artillerist and his ability to aim properly, but nonetheless, he was a very awkward-looking fellow, looked more like a scholar, someone that should be in the catacombs of a library someplace instead of a leader of men. But battle transformed Willie Pegram. And just so that you know a little bit about the man himself, he was born in Richmond, Virginia. His father died at a very early age when he was only 3 years old. The patriarch of the family became Willie's oldest brother, John Pegram, whom I'm sure you've heard of. John Pegram would command a division in Lee's army and would be killed at the Battle of Hatcher's Run. Willie grew up, had the good fortune to grow up next to an all-women's school. His mother was the head of an all-women's school, so his entire life he was surrounded by young women, and a place called Linden Row. It still stands today. It's a bed and breakfast. You can stay in the Pegram home if you like. I never have, believe it or not. My wife is a very superstitious person, and she said that she is certain I've offended Willie somehow. And so if we stay there, then we're going to see Willie's specter in the middle of the night. So I've never stayed in Linden Row, but you can go there, and I can't think, in fact, of another place in the South at least. I could be wrong. I can't think of another place where you can actually stay in the home of a Confederate general, which would be John Pegram. You can actually stay in the home of a Confederate general.
Where is this today?
It's right downtown in Richmond. It's right off Main Street, right off Franklin and Main. It's on Franklin, and the cross street is Main. It's right on Franklin. And yeah, and you can go to the Pegram house today. Pegram left Richmond to go to the University of Virginia right before the war. He wanted to be a lawyer. His father was a lawyer. Pegram was very, very determined to follow in his father's footsteps, very excited about the prospects of attending school at Charlottesville. And then when Fort Sumter came, Pegram promptly left the university, returned to Richmond, Virginia. There he rejoined F Company, his pre-war militia unit. F Company was transferred up to Fredericksburg, Virginia, and Pegram then transferred to the artillery, the Purcell Artillery, the arm in which he would distinguish himself for the rest of the war. And how I describe his behavior at Cedar Mountain, at Fredericksburg, how he handled his guns at Mechanicsville, that conspicuous behavior, that defined his career. And it also, of course, brought promotion. And so to Gettysburg, July of 1863, Willie Pegram is in command of a battalion of artillery. So you're looking at around 20 guns or so. Started the war commanding just 6 guns, Purcell Artillery. Now he's in command of a battalion of artillery. And as I indicated before, in 1864, Pegram is still full of zeal when it comes to fighting, when it comes to combat. He always wants the hottest place. He demands that from his superiors. He expects that from his men. But as I mentioned before, he tempered this aggressiveness now with, I think, a more sound judgment, more prudence. And if you turn, I saw that you all have your folders, if you can turn to my outline and flip over, you can see some maps as well. The first map of the Weldon Railroad I'd like for you to turn to. The August 21st fighting of Weldon Railroad exhibits Pegram's, I think, more mature, reasoned use of artillery. You look at the map, Willie Pegram unlimbered 8 guns right around the Davis House, directly north of the federal position above Globe Tavern. The remaining part of his battalion, around 12 guns or so, he unlimbered around the Flowers House. Dividing his guns in those 2 different sections enabled him to deliver a powerful, powerful converging fire toward the federal position there. The Confederate infantry assaults, as many of you know, failed miserably. They were botched. I don't think they were well executed. And Pegram's cannonade did little to aid the Confederate infantrymen. Not because Willie's marksmanship was off, but because the shells that he used were defective. That was a problem that Confederate artillerists had to contend with throughout the war. The fuses were unreliable, they did not go off, and so consequently, most of the rounds just bounced harmlessly over the fortifications. Nonetheless, the weight of Pegram's ordnance pinned many of those Federals to the ground. Charles Wainwright, who has left us what I believe to be the most important source from a Union officer in the Army of the Potomac, a book called A Diary of Battle. He was the artillerist in command of the Federals there. He said that he saw Union soldiers scouring behind, or retreating behind the lines. He even saw some men trying to get themselves into mud to try to get some cover from this massive demonstration of artillery fire. He said it was one of the ugliest, Wainwright said it was one of the ugliest artillery fires he had ever witnessed or been exposed to. And while Pegram's guns, again, didn't help the Confederate infantrymen in breaking the Union line, they most certainly erased any possibility at all that Warren, Gouverneur K. Warren, the Union commander there, might have entertained in delivering a counterattack against the Confederates. Any possibility of that at all, I'm sure Warren was not about to face the powerful ordnance that Willie Pegram directed there. A week later, Pegram played an even more pivotal role in the success now of Confederate infantry talks at the Battle of Reams Station, and that is your next map. Battle of Reams Station, Pegram unlimbered his guns about 400 yards away from Hancock's Union position, a line that was essentially defective because it allowed the Confederates to raid the position. I think this is an awkward parallel, but I'm going to make it anyways. Hancock's position at Reams Station should remind you somewhat of the mule chute at Spotsylvania that the Confederates occupied. You can see the bulge in the line there. A salient is very, very difficult to defend, and the Confederates and Pegram were able to take advantage of that. Now, what would Willie Pegram might have done earlier in the war? Maybe he would have raced his guns toward the Union lines, delivered a cannonade, and at the same time suffered horrendous casualties. He did not do this at Reams Station, but instead carefully placed his guns, as I said, 400 yards away from the Union position, and he made sure his guns were on the backside of a crest to defend, to protect his cannoneers. He then unleashed his artillery against Hancock's men. And this is what a primary account says. This seems almost unbelievable to me. His guns fired at a remarkable rate of 3 times a minute. 3 times a minute. One Confederate artillerist who was near the Union lines said that the shells dropped perfectly over the Union position, exploded, and it kept the Federals pinned to their trenches. Now, I should quickly add that Hancock's men here, most of them are green. They're not tested. They're not reliable at all. And although Pegram's artillery, again, I don't think it inflicted much damage, I'm not certain that it really physically hurt the Federals. Just the sheer presence, the weight of that ordnance, that in its alone kept those Federals pinned to the ground, and it paved the way for a successful Confederate assault It was a disaster from the federal perspective. John Gibbon, one of the Union divisional commanders there, said he had never seen a battlefield in which every man was bent on seeking personal safety. And in fact, at the very height of the battle, when the Federals were scurrying off the field, Hancock was overheard saying that he hoped that he never left the battlefield alive. He was so disgraced by the performance of his troops there. The Confederates returned to their trenches on August 27th. After reinstation, they were jubilant because of this decisive victory. And as I said before, Pegram's artillery played a decisive role in that. Henry Heath said, and he was one of the infantry commanders at reinstation, he said, "I measurably owe my success at reinstation to Willie Pegram." And William Nelson Pendleton, he's chief of artillery, he also attributed victory to, and I quote, "the efficiency of Colonel Pegram and the good conduct of his officers and men." So we see at reinstation on Weldon Railroad a more tempered, conservative use of artillery by Willie Pegram, something in stark contrast to how he handled his guns at the Battle of Mechanicsville. But on one issue, Pegram did not compromise, and that was his determination to do everything in his power to defeat the enemy through personal example. That was the war that Willie Pegram set out to fight, where personal courage and personal bravery would make the difference. He refused in any way, shape, or form to fall back from that standard, and he expected it from his men. Dr. Summers had mentioned the fighting at Pegram's farm, Popular Grove Church. Pegram's guns were engaged there as well. They were supporting McGowan, South Carolina Brigade, and the South Carolinians had made an attack. I think we might even, is that right map here? No, we don't have that map. It's not really necessary. But just imagine the Confederates making this counterattack. Pegram witnessed this counterattack. His guns were supporting it. Those Confederates then recoiled, staggered, and started retreating toward his guns. That would make any artillerist nervous, as you can imagine, seeing their support breaking way. Pegram saw that a crisis was developing, and so he rushed toward the Confederate infantrymen, toward McGowan, South Carolinians, leaving his guns, raced toward the infantrymen, grabbed the flag from one of the color bearers of one of the South Carolina regiments, then raced in front of the infantrymen, putting the stirrup of the flag into his boot, on a stirrup, I should say. So putting the staff of the flag in the stirrup of his boot, racing in front of the infantrymen, and then turning to the South Carolinians and pleading them to go forward. This was a post-war account from Pegram's adjutant. I'm sure it's slightly exaggerated, but nonetheless, I think it gives you a sense, an idea of Pegram's commitment to use personal leadership, bravery, to decide the outcome of a battle. Those South Carolina infantrymen formed up, and the the color bearer, raced out to Pegram. He was humiliated by this, angry that Willie had taken his flag. Pegram tried to calm this young man, told him that the only reason why he took the flag was because he was mounted, and he wanted to make sure that the entire brigade could see it. The very next day, at Squirrel Level Road, once again, Confederate infantrymen faltered in their attack. Pegram's guns were supporting them. Pegram perceived that a crisis was at hand. Once again, he raced out among the infantrymen to try to rally them, and this is where he would receive that very minor wound. So we can see that Pegram, he is fighting this war the very same way that he did at the very beginning. We need to ask ourselves, what then motivated a man like Willie Pegram to continue to fight in a reckless manner? Particularly in 1864 during the siege of Petersburg, when there are many outside the army who believe that the cause is hopeless. When it appears to many of us today, when we study the war, by the fall of 1864, what would keep, especially the Confederates, in the ranks, let alone fighting in a brave and courageous manner? What kept Willie Pegram in the ranks, I think, offers us some insights into what kept many other Confederates fighting for the cause. First and foremost, Pegram thought that Northerners were godless people. and that their armies were composed of mercenaries, and that Northerners were radicals, bent on destroying the social foundations of the South. Pegram saw the South as a Christian society. That's how he perceived it. And the evidence that he drew from to make the conclusion that Northerners were distinct and inferior people than the South, he could find right here in Virginia by what Northern soldiers did to civilian property. The destruction of barns and farms, the marauding behavior of Union soldiers. That was tangible evidence in Pegram's mind that the people above the Mason-Dixon line were of a much different mindset, a much different character. What was the most poignant evidence, though, was what happened at the Battle of the Crater. Pegram's batteries were not engaged at the Battle of the Crater. He unlimbered and observed the fighting, and I think he has left us with his description of the Battle of the Crater, one of the most outstanding Civil War letters ever written. It is a true treasure. It is incredible in its detail and in his opinions. Pegram witnessed the slaughter of those black troops that participated in the fighting at the Battle of the Crater. And he wrote to his sister that the murder of the black troops was perfectly correct and right as a matter of policy. He saw no more qualms about that at all. In fact, he said that if you went from the front lines and you were to walk all the way back into the town of Petersburg, he said that you could find dead black Union soldiers all the way back to the city. Men who clearly had surrendered but were not allowed to. He said not only was this right by a matter of policy, but he said that he had long hoped that the North would use black troops against the Confederates because it inspired Southern men to fight that much harder. He said that there were Confederate soldiers at the Crater who were wounded, who would often throw down their guns under other circumstances and go to the rear. But because they were wounded by black soldiers, it made them so angry that they refused to leave the ranks. So here was tangible proof in Pegram's mind. Look, before the war, remember what Northerners claimed about tinkering with the institution of slavery? So they had no intention of doing that, right? Well, here, they've revealed themselves. That's what Pegram would have said. They're using black troops, giving guns to black soldiers to fight against us. So that was a powerful motivation in Pegram's mind as well as many other Southerners. By 1864, too, Pegram was increasingly looking into the Army for reasons as to why he should continue to fight. And he specifically turned to Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee's battlefield record, his prowess in combat, and more importantly, his Christian bearing. That reminded Pegram and many other Southerners of another famous American, George Washington. As you might know, in the South, it was plagued by speculating during the war. Speculating that raised the prices of goods. People hoarded goods as well, too. Southerners bemoaned that as a moral crime, something they lamented constantly. And they often wondered about the moral state, the moral character of other Southerners. But they could look at Robert E. Lee, and Willie Pegram did. And in Robert E. Lee, they found a man who represented those virtues, those attributes that they thought the Confederacy represented. In fact, Pegram had so much confidence in Robert E. Lee, this is what he would write in July of 1864. My confidence in General Lee daily increases, and I think our cause more than ever, under Providence, is dependent on him. He should certainly have entire control of all military operations throughout the Confederate States. In fact, I should like to see him king or dictator. He is one of the few great men who ever lived or could be trusted. But I think what is key to understanding what motivated Willie Pegram was at the very heart of him is that duty to nation was inseparable from duty to God. I mentioned that idea that Pegram saw the South as a distinctive Christian land. So he in turn interpreted this war as a crusade, a holy crusade, fighting against the godless Northerners, and if he were to be killed in this war, what was the reward but the greatest of all for a Christian? Heaven. And Pegram believed that any loss of morale, any criticism of the Confederate government, any unwillingness to do your duty to the army, to the nation, that you were having a crisis of faith. That it was a lack of faith in God. He thought that if you just simply believed in God, that the nation, Confederate nation, would ultimately persevere. Faith was crucial to Willie Pegram, crucial to so many other Southerners as well. It's difficult, I think, for us to understand and appreciate that. Even for people who are deeply religious today, we've become such a secular society. It's hard for us to imagine when we go and look at the war to see all the hardship that those Southern soldiers endured, all the privation, and for a man to simply say, just believe, just have faith, and everything will turn out right. It's hard for us not to be a little bit skeptical of that. I started working on Willie Pegram 10 years ago. More than that, 12 years ago. And when I read these letters, I thought, he doesn't really believe this. He can't possibly believe that just to have faith that that's going to be enough. And I thought that he just wrote these letters just to boost the spirits of the people back home. I learned a valuable lesson working on Pegram, and that is to take people on their own terms. His expressions were very sincere, and he was very committed to it. This is less than a month before Appomattox. Peter wrote to his family. He said, "We must fight against everything like despondency. If all things were ordered by our enemy and the present state of affairs was placed upon us by human agency, then all hope would be lost." But Pegram, he said, knew this wasn't the case. He explained that the dark future of the Confederacy was part of Providence's plan. And he added, "God has his good purpose in chastising us now, which when it is revealed to us, we will find to have been to our good." Dr. Hathaway, I don't think he's here right now, he and a number of other people have written a very important book on why the South lost. It is the best synthesis, I think, of the existing secondary literature. It deals with the complex reasons for the Confederacy's collapse. I part way with Dr. Hathaway in a very decisive manner when it comes to his ultimate explanation for why the South lost. They believe that the South lost because of guilt over slavery. That when battlefield defeats mounted, Southerners looked inward, and to explain this misfortune during the war, this military misfortune, they thought God was punishing them. I strongly disagree with this because Southerners saw crises, military crises, as a time to do what? But to prove to the world, to prove to God that they were the faithful. And there were countless examples from the Bible that supported that assertion. What about the Jews? The Jews were God's chosen people, were they not? But they were persecuted. What about the story of Job? Job, faithful disciple of God's, he is tested by the devil in order to prove his faith to the world. So when you go to Pamplin Park today, if you go to Five Forks, and you think about all the hardships, the privations that these men had to endure, you can see that that's one way that they made sense out of this. Religion enables people to make sense out of their world. And it enabled Willie Pegram and I'd say thousands of other Confederates to do the same. It gave Willie just cause to continue fighting for the Confederacy. It also enabled him to endure tremendous personal loss as well during the war. Some of you will see Hatcher's Run today. That's where his brother John was killed February of 1865. Just a few weeks earlier, John Pegram had married supposedly the most beautiful woman in the South, Hetty Carey. It was a very joyous time in the Pegram household. Willie Pegram was very much enamored with Hetty. And this jubilance, though, would be replaced by despair. Willie and his family were devastated by the loss of John. As I said, he occupied a father-like position in Willie's life. Pegram, fortunately, was not on the field at Hatcher's Run. He was in Richmond and he was sick. I shudder to think what would have happened if he would have been out with his artillery and if he had learned of John's death. He was back home, he was ill, but he would return to the army in March. When he returned to the army, he would get promotion to full colonel of artillery. That did little, though, to comfort him. That did little to cheer him. He was very depressed by John's death. He said that when he rode the lines, when he returned back to the army in March, he would often meet some of John's friends. Henry Heath, John B. Gordon. They, of course, would express their condolences, and Willie said that his grief would break out afresh again. But Pegram still tried to speak cheering words to those around him. He still in no way relented from his sense of duty. And by the end of March, Willie Pegram and his comrades in the Confederate Army would face a new challenge. Ulysses S. Grant had organized another strike force against the South Side Railroad to protect a vital crossroads, 5 Forks. Robert E. Lee, in a weak moment, I guess, I've never been able to explain this, ordered George Pickett, of all people, to defend 5 Forks. About 6,000 infantrymen, and Willie Pegram would have 6 artillery pieces as well. Pegram, in no way, should have probably accompanied these guns with George Pickett to 5 Forks. He had 6 pieces. The remainder, most of his battalion, was over by Burgess' Mill. That's probably where his responsibility rested. But Pegram's adjutant, a man named Gordon McCabe, said that Pegram demanded to be where the fighting would take place. So on March 30th, Pegram and 6 artillery pieces accompanied Pickett's task force over to 5 Forks. It was a rainy, miserable day. The very next day, March 31st, Pickett then advanced to the south toward Dinwiddie Courthouse, engaging Phil Sheridan's troopers, pushing Sheridan's troopers all the way to the courthouse itself, about ready to deliver the knockout blow to Sheridan's troopers when darkness settled across the field. George Pickett worried about his exposed position. He had advanced south of 5 Forks. Here's 5 Forks, here's Dinwiddie Courthouse. He had advanced toward Dinwiddie Courthouse, leaving his rear exposed to Union troops to the north. So prudently, Pickett ordered a retreat that night. The Confederates, including Willie Pegram and his 6 artillery pieces, had to retrace their steps all the way back to 5 Forks. It was a decision that Pegram criticized, as well as Pegram's adjutant, a man named Gordon McCabe. Gordon McCabe and Willie were inseparable. They were both classmates at the University of Virginia. Before the war, Willie Pegram said of Gordon McCabe that he could not think of a young man that he admired more. He said McCabe was a very learned fellow, very well read. They spent an immense amount of time together, often studying the Bible, reading the Bible together. So April 1st, Pickett bedraggled soldiers reached 5 Forks, and Pickett orders Willie Pegram to place 3 of his guns at the forts itself. And you can turn to your final map if you like. As you'll see later on this afternoon, that the area around the forks is not at all conducive for artillery. It's low ground. At the time of the battle, there was woods in the area. There are no longer any trees there. Commands absolutely nothing in front. And Gordon McCabe said that to Willie. He told Willie to go to Pickett to protest this order, to tell Pickett to take these guns and to move them someplace else where they could be more effective. Pegram said no, that he would not do that. McCabe would not let up. He asked again. Pegram again said no. McCabe approached him the 3rd time, and Pegram said, "Who commands this battalion?" And I suspect that McCabe gave him the right answer and said that you do, and the 3 guns stayed there at the forts. As he was putting his guns in place there, a South Carolina soldier recognized Willie. He said that he was sitting on top his white horse, maybe the very horse that he couldn't recognize for most of the war, with his gold spectacles on his nose, and that South Carolina soldier said that he looked like a god of war. With those 3 remaining guns, Willie Pegram and Gordon McCabe then headed west down the White Oak Road as they were taking their guns to the toward the Confederate right flank. They heard the Southern soldiers strike up the Bonnie Blue flag. So morale appeared very high among Pickett's men. And Pegram would take the 3 remaining pieces and unlimber them across from the Gillum Field. The Gillum Field, the Gillum farmhouse, it presented a scene from the Old South. It's a white building that still stands. You'll be able to see that today. In that early spring morning, there was a delicious haze, as Gordon McCabe said, surrounding the building. He said that the fruit trees were bursting into bloom. Again, a striking picture, something from the Old South. Willie and McCabe and his cannoneers were exhausted. Pegram fell asleep underneath a tree near his guns on the right flank, across from the Gilliam Field. While McCabe read a newspaper, some of McCabe and Pegram's cannoneers were cooking their dinners, chatting. And it was a very, very tranquil afternoon. It appeared that there would not be any fighting at all until about 4:30, when there was an explosion of musketry because Gouverneur K. Warren's 5th Corps had launched its assault, overwhelming the Confederate left flank. Hearing this explosion of artillery and musketry fire, Pegram and McCabe sprang into their horses on their saddles, and with their horses they raced down the White Oak Road toward the forks. And when they reached the forks, the 3 guns there were already engaged. Blasting canister fire down the road, Pegram was observing the effect of his guns. He did, still mounted on his horse, took his horse between 2 of the pieces and yelled out his last order. "Fire your canister low, men." He then reeled from his saddle, collapsed on the ground, and yelled out, "Oh, Gordon, I am mortally wounded. Take me off the field." A bullet had pierced his left arm and passed completely through his side. McCabe quickly dismounted, rushed to the aid of his colonel, called for some stretcher bearers, who soon arrived, but the firing was so intense at the forks that those 2 stretcher bearers cowered to the ground. McCabe had to brandish a saber, threaten to hurt the men if they did not get off the ground, and carry Colonel Pegram to the rear, which they finally did. Took him to an ambulance. McCabe followed, watched as they put the stretcher into the ambulance, and then Pegram grabbed McCabe's hand and said, "Tell Mother and both my sisters that I commend them to God's protection." Pegram then pleaded with McCabe to remain with him for his final hours. McCabe said that he would, but that he needed to return to the guns first, which he did, and he repeated Willie's final order to fire your canister low. McCabe then rejoined the ambulance as it made its way off the field, and I think there is. You can see the ambulance route, Pegram's ambulance route off the battlefield. Confederate left flank had collapsed, and for a while, that ambulance was between 2 opposing parallel lines of battle. So it was a very sticky situation. It appeared that maybe Willie would get captured. And while McCabe and Pegram were in the ambulance, they talked and prayed the entire time. Pegram said, "I am perfectly resigned if it is God's will to take me, but it will be such a blow to them at home." No doubt Pegram was thinking about the recent death of his brother John. "My God," McCabe cried out, "why hast thou forsaken me?" "Don't say that, Gordon," Pegram quickly responded. "It is not right." As Pegram's ambulance was heading off the field, he no doubt also heard his guns fired for the last time. Those guns at the forks would be captured, the only guns Pegram would lose during the entire war. Willie Pegram had kept his promise that he had made at Cedar Mountain. Whenever his guns would be captured, he said to look for my dead body. Pegram's ambulance covered about 10 miles from Five Forks to Ford's Depot. They reached the depot about 10 o'clock at night. There was a house right across from the depot where there were a number of other wounded Confederate soldiers. McCabe had Pegram's body escorted into the house, but word quickly spread that Federals were approaching, Federal cavalry. All the able-bodied men fled the house, except for McCabe, who stayed with his comrade for their final ordeal. Pegram fell asleep about a half hour after they reached the house at Ford's Depot. A stupor quickly followed, from which he never emerged. McCabe spent the entire night wetting back his hair, moistening his lips, saying prayers, he said, calling him 1,000 fond names. At one point, McCabe even fell to his knees, again, pleading with God to spare his life instead of Pegram's. About 8 o'clock on April the 2nd, fittingly a Sunday, Willie Pegram died, according to McCabe, as gently as an infant. McCabe was devastated. He took his friend's body with the help of some slaves behind that house, laid him out in his uniform. McCabe read the Episcopal service over him. And he remarked in a letter to Pegram's sister shortly thereafter about Willie's appearance, "Oh, what a splendid soldier he looked." Advancing Union cavalry shortened McCabe's final moments with his best friend. McCabe jumped on a horse, headed to the west to try to rejoin Lee's army, which he eventually did. And while with Lee's army, as it was headed toward Appomattox, McCabe still thought he was in close communion with Willie. He said that he still spoke fondly to his spirit. And just a day or two before Appomattox, McCabe was surveying the Army of Northern Virginia. Did not resemble the army that McCabe so fondly had thought of. It's collapsing right in front of him. Fragmented, disorganized. And McCabe described that. He said, "When I see the crowd of striders and then look across at the Blue Ridge and think that I must give up this beloved Virginia because of the faint-heartedness and cowardice of these men who have deserted their colors, my heart bursts with a sob. If the men will only remain at their post and trust in God, everything would go right. If we lose our country, it is our own fault." Willie Pegram would have fully agreed. Thank you. I have plenty of time, actually. I had class this morning. So.
Questions, please? Any evidence that you've come across about Pegram's reaction to the use of black troops from Confederates?
Yeah, that's a very interesting reaction to that. He was in favor of it. One, for a personal reason, because his middle brother, James West Pegram, received a command, what they called the Corps de Afrique or something like that, and he received a commission. And so Pegram approved of it because it helped one of his family members. And I think that that is, more importantly, a testament to his determination to forge a Confederate nation. That ultimately that these men were willing to dismantle at least a portion of the institution of slavery in order to help the Army become more effective militarily. And so, I mean, that's one of the great ironies is that here these Southerners that had set out to fight a war that in many ways was a war to preserve slavery. They are willing to compromise on that issue at the very end, at least some of them are, in order to persevere and to secure their independence. And so Pegram didn't see a great conflict in that. I think people have made, some unreasonable conclusions, though, by saying that accepting the use of black troops in the Confederate Army was an abandonment of the institution of slavery completely. I don't think that that's a logical conclusion at all. No one ever doubted that you could have black men shouldering muskets in the Confederate Army, but you could still have the institution of slavery. And once you've secured your independence, who's to say that the institution of slavery could not revive itself as well, too? And that's, I think sometimes people get uneasy when I talk so much about slavery and the Confederate cause and Pegram's ideas. I think that part of that uneasiness is that there's a sense that I'm criticizing Pegram, that I'm condemning him for holding slaves. I'm doing no such thing. What I'm saying is that we need to take people on their own terms, understand them from their perspective, and from Willie Pegram's perspective, the institution of slavery was a Christian institution, and it, along with many other things, is what he thought gave the South a unique status in God's eye. And he was not alone in that. You've got to remember, Willie Pegram, his ideas, his understanding of the world is shaped during the 1850s. That is a time in which Southern theologians, Southern intellectuals, they have come up with an elaborate, very sophisticated defense of the South's way of life. Not just the institution of slavery, but they are defending the South by doing what? Attacking the North. Talking about the evils of free labor and about the proliferation of all these godless organizations, not just the abolitionists, but the women's rights movement that they saw in the North. They refer to it to all these isms going up in the North. They saw the North as a home of radicalism The South was a bulwark against them. Yes, sir.
Is there any indication that Willie Pegram was acquainted with John Pelham, who was another young artillerist in the Confederate
He
Corps?
never mentions Pelham in his wartime letters. Gordon McCabe said that at the Battle of Fredericksburg, Pegram's guns were on Prospect Hill, not far from where Pelham had one of his finest days at Fredericksburg, where he raced out with, I think, just 2 guns. Pegram witnessed that, and Pegram said that he admired Pelham very much. But they used their artillery in very much the same fashion, although, as I point out, Pegram became more conservative in his use of the guns and probably more effective in the process. There's a great analogy that Bob Crick once made between, I think you all know Bob Crick and Gary Gallagher, between Pelham and Pegram. People always confuse Pelham and Pegram. They both begin with P, they both are young artillerists, and so that always happens. Pegram has always had to live under the shadow of John Pelham. But Bob Crick made the analogy at Cedar Mountain once, and Gary Gallagher was there. He said that Gallagher and him were a lot like Pegram and Pelham. Crick considered himself Pegram, Gallagher Pelham. He said, now look, you look at the war, he said, Pegram was as fine an artillerist as Pelham, if not better. But Pelham gets all the credit because Pelham was good looking and dashing. He said, now look at us as historians. I'm a lot better historian than Gary Gallagher, but Gary Gallagher's good looking. So that's why he gets all the credit.
I'm trying to think of the source, but there is a study, I understand, a famous study of the medical records that concluded that artillery casualties cause less than 10%.
That wouldn't surprise me at all. I have a hunch in terms of actually inflicting damage and punishing the enemy. It did very little, particularly on the Confederate side, because ordnance was so unreliable. What happened at the Weldon Railroad, not having the fuse explode, that was a problem that, as I said before, Confederate artillerists had to contend with, or they would explode prematurely. And Reporter Alexander, which I consider the most important book on the Confederate side in Virginia, the book Fighting for the Confederacy, he said that it was a common sight on the battlefield to see Confederate infantrymen as they advanced toward the enemy to turn and to shake their fists at their own artillerists because the artillerist shells were exploding prematurely and raining fragments down and hurting their own men. And these Confederate infantrymen threatened to shoot their own artillerists if they didn't stop firing over their heads. So, particularly on the Confederate side, because the ordnance was so unreliable, I doubt that they actually ever hurt the enemy in terms of inflicting casualties. But again, the presence of those guns, not only did I think it instilled confidence in the infantry that they were supporting, but I think it did a lot to unnerve whoever they were firing at. And Ream Station is a perfect example of that. Pegram blanketed that area, firing 3 times a minute. I think it paved the way for the Confederate assault.
Would that remark extend to the use of canister as opposed to?
I think I'm sorry, and I should have distinguished between that. On the defensive at close range, canister is overwhelming and decisive. So that, and I'm glad you pointed that out, but I think that's how we should distinguish it. On the offense, artillery fire's effectiveness, I would say, is uneven at best. It's difficult to gauge, but I don't think it's as effective as some of us might have imagined. Because the ordnance isn't reliable. One other thing that we should think about is the density of targets. Gettysburg is a powerful demonstration of that. Here's that massive cannonade on July 3rd, centered against Cemetery Ridge. But when you think about the density of the target, meaning that it's not, if you were to fire from the north above Cemetery Hill and to fire down the line, there's a dense target. You miss Cemetery Hill, you're going to hit somewhere down the line. If you're firing straight ahead against Cemetery Ridge, if you don't hit right along the stone wall there, you're going to overshoot. You don't have much room for error as an artillerist. So to soften up a position before an attack using artillery in an offensive manner, I think they had a number of things. The artillerist had a number of factors conspiring against them. There wasn't enough room for error, and their ordnance was just too unreliable. But at close range, when infantry's attacking at you with canister, overwhelming and decisive.
What size, what weapons was Willie Pegram using at Petersburg?
his battalion, the makeup of the battalion would change, and he would even get mortars, and some of his field pieces would be replaced. But he had Napoleons. I don't know what else he had.
This battle of Five Forks, would he have been positioned in Napoleon's?
No, he didn't have Napoleons there, and he had rifled Parrots, as I understand. And Chris should tell you about this. Chris told me about this once. It's mildly interesting. Is that there was canister for these rifled Parrots, which is, according to Chris Calkins, who related tonight, was extremely rare. And Chris was always suspicious as to whether Pegram really had canister there because he didn't have Napoleons, but had these rifled Parrots. But Chris met up with a man that did some metal detecting in that area, and in fact has 50 to 75 rounds that Pegram used, or wasn't able to use at Five Forks. Because what Pegram's cannoneers did, and what I would imagine is a real violation of military regulation, is that they dug pits near their guns at the forks, right next to them, and in those pits, they stacked those canister rounds. So this man with his metal detector hit this pit and was literally just called out between 30 and 50 canister rounds that had been positioned in there so Pegram's men could fire their guns rapidly. But Chris could give you the exact, in terms of the weaponry and how unusual it was. But Calkins claims it was very, very unusual.
Peter, is there any place at Five Forks where artillery could have been used effectively on the defense?
You can maybe say the Confederate left flank where there were some guns already, just I think 2 pieces, and they were with Gregor. Maybe on the Federal right flank. Pickett faced an impossible situation there. I mean, it's really easy to make fun of Pickett because he's not the most reliable of officers, but I'm not certain what he could have done there to defend against that onslaught of the 5th Corps. So no matter where those guns would have been placed, to think that it might have made a difference, I doubt it. There's no question that Pickett deserves heavy criticism for his irresponsibility, for not having a sense of what was going on along his lines. Gordon McCabe, Willie's adjutant, was so bitter about the placement of those 3 guns at the forks that McCabe wrote after the war that George Pickett knew more about 5 brands of whiskey than he did about the placement of artillery. So McCabe was very, very angry, and he said after the war that he blamed Pickett for the death of his Colonel Peter.
He just ran out of luck.
He did. I mean, it's amazing that
He survived that long from his behavior pattern you're describing.
it's amazing. At Cedar Mountain, what I didn't mention is that he was able to calculate, I don't know how Pegram had the presence of mind to do this, he was able to calculate the number of times a Yankee sharpshooter fired at him. And then I don't think Pegram used a good judgment to tell his mother and sister about it. I think the last thing his mother and sister wanted to read about was about a sharpshooter taking pop shots at him. And Pegram said he had 3 holes in the skirt of his coat to prove the Yankee sharpshooters weren't very good marksmen at all. At Crater, he thought it was hilarious that his hat had been plucked by a bullet because it came very close to a place where he was wounded at Antietam. He was wounded by a shell fragment at Antietam. It plucked his hat not far from that wound, and he said, "What a remarkable coincidence." Again, something I don't think his mom and sister were probably all thrilled about reading. But battle did something to Pegram. It transformed him. Henry Heath said that Willie Pegram was one of the few men he ever knew who was supremely happy in battle. But what I tried to do with my book, and what I tried to do with this talk as well, is to get beyond that. I think it's important to do that, to just reduce Pegram's motivation to the fact that he had insatiable thirst for combat tells us absolutely nothing about what motivated him. He fought recklessly because it was a demonstration of his ideas. And I think James McPherson's book called What They Fought For is a very, very good reminder that most Civil War soldiers did fight for ideas. These men were very idealistic. There was a moral purpose to this war on both sides. You can't get men to behave the way they did just because of shared comradeship in the ranks. There has to be something higher there. And I think the proof is in the writings of the soldiers themselves.
Yeah, a quick question as to his religious fervor that you mentioned. Was there any clergy in his family, background, religious training of some kind? Because he was...
I didn't come across any at all. All these young men, if you look, Pegram is really representative of a generation of young Southerners who are extremely pious, deeply religious, and their perspective is grounded in a religious worldview. Because remember, again, when they're coming of age in the 1850s, and we could list a number of other officers that share that same outlook. The deeply religious people, and the only way to understand the Old South is, I think, through a religious foundation. And it carried over into their Confederate experience. But I'm working on my dissertation now, looking at Pegram's generation, and one thing that has helped me understand is that when I look at the Civil War, I shouldn't look at it as just what happened between 1861 and 1865. These young men brought to them experiences, ideas, a living memory from the past, from the 1850s. The Civil War was a resolution of many of the issues, many of the ideas that they were dealing with in the 1850s. And when they entered Confederate service in 1861, it wasn't just a covenant that they were making with God, but there were a number of other issues, particularly the revolutionary generation, and especially if you're a Virginian. You feel a close tie to that revolutionary generation. And so here's an opportunity for Virginians, and young Virginians really do believe this, to redeem the state of Virginia. Here in the Revolution, the state had produced all these great men, intellectuals, thinkers. What had happened since then? All Virginians lamented this. The state had been on decline, materially, morally, intellectually. Where were the great men in Virginia? Alexander Sandy Pendleton of Jackson's staff, he said, in the 1850s, as a student at Washington College, he said, we once were a race of giants, now we're a race of dwarfs. So now the war comes, and for young Virginians like Pegram, here's the moment, here's the opportunity. We'll redeem the state of Virginia. We will make it great once again. And they say it explicitly. This isn't any... Bob Craig, who is one of my mentors as well, he sometimes likes to not claim me, would say that this is psychobabble. I'd say that's silliness because they write it. It's right in their letters. It's not... I'm not looking at their relationship and how they thought about their mother or anything like that. As Bob would say, that's what I'm doing. It's right in their letters. It's right in their diaries. It's overwhelming testimony.
Other questions? Thanks very much.
Good.